Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi Country in Caboolture as usual. Today I'm in the studio with Tim Gill. I reached out to you because I saw a post that somebody on my LinkedIn community put up about how far children roam and how much less it is today than it was in our great-grandfather's time. I was really curious about that, so I just reached out to you. I thought it would be great to talk about that because I see that children very seldom walk these days. I just wanted to find out a little bit more. Thank you, Tim, for coming on the show. And whereabouts are you calling from?
Well, it's great to be here, Wendy. I am speaking to you from a wet and grey London on the other side of the world.
Let's talk about this map that I saw, which was the roaming. So if you wouldn't mind describing that.
It is a map that shows you what you might call the roaming range of 4 8-year-old children. They are in 4 generations of the same family who all grew up in the same city. So if you can picture the map, there's a big blob that covers most of this map that shows the roaming range of the great-grandfather in this family. At the age of 8, he could go 10k, 6 miles across the city on his own. And then you can see how the circles or the shapes shrink until you're left with a dot on the map, which is the roaming range of the son in this family. At the age of 8, he can actually go to the end of his street. It really highlights what I call the shrinking horizons of childhood. Over the generations, children have lost a huge amount of everyday freedom, of the right to roam, to the degree that most primary age children, and it's an emotive term, but are more or less reared in captivity. And that's completely new. Throughout human history, we have never seen a situation where the young of our species are spending a huge amount of their time in their formative years indoors and effectively under close supervision. I think that's one of the most profound and one of the most underexplored changes in the nature of childhood. Yes, that's just one family, but it's the perfect encapsulation of what's happening for boys and girls around the world, all social classes. And it's been happening for about 40, 50, 60 years now. Gradual, but seemingly unstoppable. And I think that raises really important questions for us about what's happening in kids' lives and about the consequences of that loss of freedom and autonomy.
You said it was the great-grandfather, and then it was the grandmother, and then it was the mother, and then now the son. Is that correct?
That's right. It's possible the gender might differ a little bit. Gender does affect things. We know girls, they're kept closer to home. They're more restricted than boys. That's been the case for many generations. The overall trend affects girls and boys. This is gradual creeping. You could call it a kind of lockdown. We're all familiar with lockdowns, having been through the pandemic. But really what that was a kind of speeding up of this process that has in fact been unfolding over different generations of the lives of children for the past 2 or 3 generations.
Because you said great-grandfather, so I'm trying to think about what year that would be.
In this case, it was about 100 years ago, early 1910s. Interestingly, since I found that map, by the way, I didn't draw up the map. It was actually William Bird, who's a health advocate here in the UK. But I found other maps that other newspapers or media or researchers have put together in Sweden, in Ireland, in the Netherlands, in Austria. They all tell the same story. The years are slightly different. And of course, sometimes different circumstances, different families, but the trend is absolutely clear. And the key point is that the biggest change has happened in the last generation. That's the time period where you could say children have lost all what you might call their spatial freedoms. A generation ago, it was not unusual for 8, 9, 10-year-olds to be able to go out to the park or to go around to their mates or to get to school on their own. And now in many countries, although not all, that is unusual or indeed almost never seen.
I read today an article and it said the physical infrastructure makes a difference for social media use with children. If the child had the capacity to travel independently, say they had their bike and they could just go to their friends or the park, then social media increased their amount of in-person contact. But if you had unsafe infrastructure for children, so you just had high-speed streets like we have here, 50 kilometres an hour in suburban streets, which is 30 miles an hour in the UK, and you didn't have separated bike paths, you didn't have all that infrastructure that was there, the children withdrew away from face-to-face contact.
I haven't heard of that research, but I think a couple of things I'd react to. Firstly, it brings out that children's online and offline lives are completely interconnected today, that we can't really talk about them separately. Children themselves, from quite a young age, are sharing what they're doing online, what they're reading about, and their relationships online are shaping their lives offline, completely interconnected. But what it also suggests to me is that a healthy childhood is still a childhood where children can get around and see their friends and do the things they want to do IRL, in real life. The problems happen when that isn't an option, when children are in effect being kept under kind of a form of, it's a really emotive term. I'm hesitating to use it because I can imagine parents listening to this now. We all, as parents, I'm a parent, we want to do the best for our kids. But there are a growing number of children who are experiencing a form of incarceration in their childhood. They're being kept in, and from quite a young age, to the degree that it's entirely normalised. And that is a system problem. It's not the problem of individual parents who are making bad choices. It's a problem that's been almost imposed on many parents because of the way we live our lives, and as you've hinted at, partly, and I think in large part, because of the neighbourhoods, the human habitats that children are growing up in, which are not healthy habitats. And that's what's brought me over the years to focus on how we can expand children's horizons, how we can give children back some of that everyday freedom that many of us parents and people in their 30s and 40s and 50s and even a little bit older can remember from our own childhoods.
How did you become interested in this idea of how far are children moving from home and how independent are they?
I left university, one motivated to try and make the world a better place. I started working for a charity, an NGO that promoted the importance of outdoor play. This was about 30 years ago. And I realised through the work of that charity, probably the biggest single barrier to kids being outdoors and playing was traffic danger. It's complicated. There are lots of things that come together to restrict children's freedoms, but I felt and still feel that that's the most fundamental, powerful, legitimate fear. It's the only thing that can really explain this long trend that we've been talking about that goes back 60 or 70 years. And also just on an everyday basis, it makes sense. Every time I see a parent with a young child walking down the street, what's the first thing the parent says if the child starts walking away or scooting away? But mind the traffic, don't go on the road. It's absolutely deeply embedded in the way all of us navigate the world around us, is this threat from traffic. And when I say traffic, I simply mean large moving objects. Over the last 10 or 15 years, I've focused more and more on these system problems about urban planning, design, transport, and how we can make neighbourhoods healthier places for children to grow up, and how we can give parents, we can make it easier for parents to say, yes, you can go down to the park, or you can walk to school, or you can go round the corner and play in the bush, and how we can make it easier for children to do what children have always wanted to do and will always want to do, which is to gradually explore and understand and make sense of the world around them and feed their curiosity and their interest, which is one of the fundamental things about play. Play as a kind of life force that I also feel we need to value more. Children are playing quite a lot, but they're playing online, and you can see a lot of play behaviour online, but they're playing there because we're not making it easy for them to play IRL. That's what has to change, and that comes back to the way we we and the way that governments and decision makers allow neighbourhoods to be shaped. And neighbourhoods are far too often shaped around the needs of the car, not around the needs of children and indeed humans generally. We are not creating very human-friendly habitats. I think Australia is probably one of the places that's doing the worst job. And I don't like to kind of badmouth. I've worked in Australia. I've visited Australia, I think maybe 9 or 10 times in the last 10 or 15 years. I have lots of friends in Australia. I love coming to the country, but you are doing a terrible job of creating healthy habitats for the young of your country.
This is what I'm trying to do, is to encourage this. Well, the way I put it is there is only opportunity.
By the way, it's not like we're doing a fantastic job here in the UK. I just want to say, if this were a competition, I'd say, you Aussies are probably quite low down the league table, but there's no way that we're much higher here in the UK. And it's interesting, you look at where the countries where children are happiest. We've got lots of data now about children's well-being. Where are they happiest? They're happiest in countries like the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, Scandinavia. And these are places where, where it's easy for children to get around on their own, where they're spending more time outdoors and playing, where some of those anxieties that we have around mental health and around screen time, they're there, but they're much less. And I think those are connected because, again, what it comes back to is sort of agency and autonomy. And that one of the things that is absolutely fundamental to people feeling good about themselves and about how their life is going is the sense that I am somebody who has agency. I can do something to make my life better, or to make my own way in life, or to just enjoy the situation I find myself in. And that's very closely connected with our ability to get around and to think, well, actually, I don't want to be here doing this thing. I want to be over there doing that thing. Agency, movement, exploration, feeding our appetite for experience and understanding. Those are really at the heart of what I'm talking about when I'm thinking about children's spatial lives.
My understanding is that London now has low traffic zones or low traffic neighbourhoods. Also, a lot of places are going down to 20 miles an hour, 30 kilometres an hour from 50 kilometres an hour, which is 30 miles an hour. Have you seen any changes in the play patterns of children as a result of that?
Yes, we have. They tend to be those where you've got quite dramatic changes in neighbourhoods. So you really cut down traffic pretty much altogether. Then you see more kids playing out. A dramatic example of that was during our first lockdown 3.5 years ago. The streets were completely quiet. What happened? Families came out and started playing in the streets. Children started drawing hopscotch patterns in the street. There's a photo of just that in my book, In Urban Playground. So we know that happens. But now it takes quite radical restrictions. Just lowering the speed limit doesn't seem to be enough to make a massive difference to children's spatial freedoms. It actually does make a big difference to how many children get killed and hurt being run over. And that's a good thing, right? Let's not forget that. But there's mixed evidence. I'm a numbers person. I really think it's important to look at the evidence. And the evidence on simply slowing traffic on the whole is that it's not enough on its own to change those habits. And that goes back to how deeply ingrained in our mindsets is this awareness of the threat from traffic. We really need to almost get to a point where cars are out of the picture. The worrying thing about all that is that in some respects, in many cities, we're going the wrong direction. Cars are getting bigger. Streets are feeling less safe. We're all spending more time indoors and on screens. So there's a potential for a sort of doom loop. London and other cities are taking measures to turn that around. But as I say, it seems to be that measures like school streets, so that's an interesting scheme. So this is where you entirely shut down the street outside of schools to traffic. So no traffic outside the school gates. Sometimes it's just for an hour or so, beginning and the end of the school day. Sometimes it's permanent and it's effectively a kind of pedestrianisation. And so maybe sometimes it's somewhere in between. Those schemes, especially the ones that are more radical, are having a big impact on kids walking and biking to school. That's the main aim, actually, is to promote walking and biking and to get more parents to think, oh, you know what, I'll walk today, or Johnny can go on the bike. And I know that's okay. I know it's safe, because the chaos that used to happen outside the school gates with everybody dropping their kids off and trying to get as close as they possibly can isn't going to happen anymore. So those sorts of schemes seem to be the ones that are having the biggest hit, the quickest, most dramatic influence on getting more kids out of doors, being active and playing. There's potential over time for looking at different types of schemes, pulling together different measures that will turn this around. one of the things we're up against is deeply ingrained safety mindset and very strong transport habits that we know are difficult to turn around. What I would say to parents listening to this is that there is a huge amount to gain. Ask any parent, do you want to live in a world where there's more traffic in 10 years' time and where it's harder for your kids to play outdoors and get around? Or do you want to live in a world where it's easier to get around and where there's less traffic? And we know what parents will say. So the challenge is about building a kind of consensus, a movement almost, a shared vision for the kind of neighbourhoods that, if any of us thought about it, are the neighbours we want to live in, that are safer, that are less car dominated, where there are more people outdoors, more children playing, enjoying the real world and feeling less anxious and more connected and more confident in themselves. I mean, who doesn't want that?
I was struck by what you were saying about agency. I read an autobiography of Florence Nightingale, who experienced terrible depression. She just has no sense of agency, which is why she took up nursing. She wanted to participate in the world. What you're saying there strikes me as being very, very similar, that the confinement that women have experienced over generations is sort of what we're inflicting on our children in a way.
Yes, and I think in particular, and this is the other area of work that I focus on, the world is an unpredictable place. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. For most of us and for most people listening to this, the world is a pretty safe place and safer than it probably ever has been. But still, we don't know quite what's going to happen. Uncertainty is woven into the universe. But what is important is we humans feel that we are able to cope with that uncertainty. We can deal with the everyday ups and downs of life. That's a big part of what feeling healthy and confident and capable is. It's okay, I might not know what's around the corner, but I'm pretty confident that I can deal with it. And that has to involve gradually expanding our horizons and learning about the world around us and how we deal with those challenging situations. In other words, if we deprive children of basic diet of experience, we might be thinking that we're keeping them safe, we're keeping them out of harm's way, but actually we're building a kind of learned helplessness. We're depriving them of the very kinds of experience that help children as they grow up learn to deal with the everyday ups and downs of life, which might be physical challenges. Can I get through the woods? Can I climb this tree? It might be social challenges. Can I deal with this tricky situation? My friend's not being very nice to me. I'm experiencing this aggression from somebody. All of these, many of us remember from our own childhoods, that it's not always easy to figure out how to deal with stressful situations. But the way we learn is through experiencing those situations. For a parent, there's a kind of balancing act going on, and it's fundamental to parenting. On the one hand, as your child grows up, you're allowing them to gradually spread their wings, deal with different situations. That first walk to school on their own, the first time they go out with friends without an adult around, their first date, these things come along. But on the other hand, you're not throwing your child to the winds. You're not allowing a 3-year-old to wander the streets on their own. There's no such thing as a zero-risk childhood. Being a good parent means gradually allowing that journey and that transfer of responsibility to happen. Parents who may be feeling, oh my God, I'm worried about this or that threat, that's understandable, but I want to remind parents, please also worry about how your childhood can make that journey if you never allow them to take the next step. Crucially, let's come together and work together as parents and with councils and with decision makers so that this journey through childhood really is a healthy journey, and at the end of it you've got confident, capable, responsible, healthy, independent people.
I did a psychology degree. We did attachment theory. Our listener may not be aware of attachment theory. It's basically where the parent, usually the mother, is seen as the secure base, and attachment theory is that the child will go away and then come back. And of course, sometimes the mother is not able to be there because, well, she has her own needs. She's a human being. There is a rupture in the relationship temporarily. The question is, how do you repair that relationship after those ruptures? It strikes me that you're saying exactly the same thing, that we have the freedom, we move, we expand, and sometimes it doesn't go right, and that's where we learn, and then we overcome that and we repair our connections and our sense of of safety in the world by thinking, well, how could I do differently next time?
I also did a degree that was partly psychology. I'm interested in attachment theory. One of the things that I think is perhaps clearer now than it was at the time is that strand of thinking can sometimes overemphasize a single relationship with one parent and under-recognize the value of different types of human connection with other adults and, interestingly, with other children. But I think the basic pattern that we're talking about, it's imagining a kind of elastic that as children grow up, they gradually stretch that elastic. You would let go a little bit further away if you were, say, on the beach or in a park than you would let an 18-month-old toddler, and then a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, 15-year-old. So you can see this extension, the stretching, but also the idea that, yes, the parent, the carer, the family, the nucleus of the family will be there, ready and providing that basic caring and home base support. Where this gets interesting is, if you like, the end game, that we would surely want our children to reach a point where they can feel confident taking the big steps in making their own life, in some sense surrendering the idea that there's one home and it's the home of their parents, and actually they're starting to make their own home and to truly become independent human beings. At various points in that journey, it's more difficult than it used to be for parents. There's a greater levels of anxiety. There's a sense of being in a goldfish bowl, that if you make a mistake, then you're instantly held up. Your decisions can be torn apart. Social media reinforces both the sense of being constantly under the microscope, but also that we're expected to make instant responses, living in our emotional world and finding it difficult to step back and say, oh, hang on a minute, that was a scary moment there, but actually it's part of life. I don't envy parents. My daughter's now 26. She's old enough that we were not subjected to some of the pressures that parents today are facing. But I would come back to saying that I'm not a parenting expert. My focus, and I cannot overemphasize this, is in getting everybody else to make decisions that make it easier for parents to do the right thing and for children to have healthy childhoods. But I do want parents to be on my side. I do feel it's important for me to remind parents of what I think parents know from their own childhoods and from their own insights into being a parent, that there is no such thing as a zero-risk childhood, that we do well by children through helping them on this journey to independence, and that we can work together. We can get support from other parents and from professionals and from decision makers, and we can build a shared vision about how we can all support children on this journey through to a sort of happy, healthy life.
I was just thinking about my own childhood. I have two brothers. We were able to go everywhere, extremely independent, given incredible amount of freedom. And it did feel a little bit underheld. There is definitely a bit of a better ground, but I would say that I noticed that other people are really afraid to try new things. Whereas I'm just like, oh yeah, I'll just go and talk to anybody, and I'll go and say hello, and I'll do this and I'll do that. And I've lived in all different countries and I've done things because I'm quite bold, actually, because I just figure, well, what's the worst that can happen? I'll just say hello. And if the person turns out to be creepy, I'll go bye and then run in the opposite direction. And I think there is a bit of a fear that you can't stretch yourself and make a mistake. In Queensland, which is where we are, there was a really terrible case about a boy who called Daniel Morecambe. They changed the legislation because of it, where he was waiting at a bus stop. The bus didn't stop. Somebody was predatory and just took the opportunity. And the opportunity was there actually because there was no bus service and the boy couldn't ride his bike.
It's a terrible tragedy. I can think of one or two cases in the UK where something similar has happened. And I wish I could promise and wave a magic wand and give a gift to your listeners that nothing like that would ever happen again. Sadly, one of the things about living in an uncertain world is that sometimes extremely rare but profound tragedies happen. I don't think it's ever been any different. I think when you and I were growing up, when our parents and grandparents were growing up, there were similar tragedies. It's a fact of human life and it's terrible. And I'm not sure any of us can make a gift that says that the world will be better in that respect, that we can eliminate those extremely rare tragedies. What we can do is think more about how we respond to them and whether our responses, our social responses and our individual responses, are proportionate. And proportionate's a really helpful idea here. Overall, as a parent, How do I respond? And also, what might the side effects be? If I say to my child, no, you're never going to go out on your own, I'm not going to allow you to get the bus because it might not turn up and then terrible things might happen. That child, my child, the child who I've said that to, are they going to develop a sense of confidence and an ability to deal with the more everyday social situations, going to a party, getting their first job and figuring out how they travel there? I can quote numbers, but I suspect that many listeners won't be very influenced by numbers. But what I want listeners to feel and to connect to emotionally is the importance of your child growing up confident and capable, helping them to deal with much more everyday situations that will actually shape their lives. And also to recognize that we're a social species. One of the things that makes us feel safer out and about in the streets and in towns is that there are other people around as well. Being in a situation where you're isolated and where there's no one who might step in and help out is part of the problem. And that's where it comes back to these everyday transport choices. You talked earlier about some of the changes that are happening in London, low traffic neighbourhoods. These are schemes where we're cutting out traffic from residential neighbourhoods. There's now a body of research of the impact of these changes. One of the things that we're finding is that in low traffic neighbourhoods where there's less car traffic, more walking and biking, there's lower levels of street crime. Now we're talking about ordinary street crime here, people having their mobile phone taken, or that sort of everyday street crime is lower in those low traffic neighbourhoods. So that proves that we can build a sense of social connection and social safety that can be part of this bigger picture of more child-friendly and actually more welcoming and human-friendly neighbourhoods.
What I heard there was actually a sense of community and a sense of trust. We interviewed Conrad Kickett on a show. His area of research was the bit between the front garden and the street, and those connections that you have as you walk on the street high by, that actually gives you a sense of connection to a place. What you're describing sounds like it's building trust in the community. You can imagine if you're walking, everybody sees the neighbours, everybody sees the same people all the time walking up and down. You do get a sense of when something's not right or whatever, you do go, oh no, that doesn't feel right or whatever. So I think that is important.
There's some nice studies, some research that Vic Health did actually in Australia, where they explored this idea of connection with children. And they simply asked children to draw mental maps, to draw on paper their mental pictures of their neighbourhood. And they compared the pictures that were drawn by kids who walked or biked to school on the one hand, and kids who were driven to school on the other. The kids who walked or biked to school had quite an actual map that showed different locations, parks, shops, how they fitted together with their own home and the school. The kids who were driven basically just drew list pictures: dog, tree, house, school, with no richness or structure to it. And I think that is a nice illustration. Connection to people and connection to place are quite closely linked. We know our neighbours, we know where the shops are. Maybe as a child we might know where we can go to if we need to get help. All of that richness of connection, it's fed by our experience of being active and having a life that's woven into our neighbourhoods. And if our life is entirely lived in our homes, in our cars, and then in school or the other institutions that we're in, that's a very different and much more impoverished childhood.
I call that the boxed life. You go from the box of the house to the box of the car to the box of the shops to the box of the school to the box of somebody else's house, inside everywhere, which can't be good. Say our listener is somebody at council who's in senior management who designs all our footpaths. What would you suggest is something to bear in mind for that person to include that would make it better for kids to be able to roam?
I would invite decision makers to think about neighbourhoods and to picture both the places that families and children want to go to and the connections between those places as a kind of web, like a spider web. Anything that they can do that can help strengthen the webs, so particularly for walking and biking, that can make it easier to walk and bike, make it reduce the volume and or speed of traffic, will just help parents and ultimately help children to make those healthy choices of walking and biking. And say it might take time, so I think physical changes to the streets and the sidewalks, also maybe thinking about what you might call software changes, programming, events, play street programs. There have been There's some Australian councils that have run programs where residential streets can be shut for 2 or 3 hours at the weekend, simply so families can come out and play. The school streets programs that I talked about. Play Australia, which is the campaigning organisation that promotes play in Australia, has been running a Play Streets program for some years now. So you may find that there are communities in Queensland that have already been trying this. That's a slightly long answer to the question. Short answer, anything that can make it easier to walk and bike, and those connections that families want to be making, and seeing neighbourhoods through the eyes of children and families is really helpful. And also remembering that lots of these measures do get pushback because of just how car-oriented our neighbourhoods are and our culture is. Talking about the benefits for children and grounding these changes in this vision of a better, healthier neighbourhood for children can help to reduce that pushback and to build a shared consensus about the long term, because we're talking about changes that we are going to have to make over the long term. And also that is a kind of communal vision, that it's bringing us together rather than going down the sort of road of more and more isolation and that families are just having to fend for themselves. That's a dead end. That's not a vision of society that anybody's going to feel very positive about. Right now, families feel like it's hard work. And this is part of the message, that creating more child-friendly communities will actually take some of the load off families. It will mean that parents who are currently maybe spending 4 or 5 hours a week taxiing their kids to here, there and everywhere can get some of that time back, because the kids can make the journeys on their own. That's a gift in our very hectic lifestyles, to be able to get that time back. Those are the things I would say that decision makers should be talking about. So it's not about we're coming in and cars are bad and we're going to try and tame the traffic. It's how do we support children to grow up happy and healthy, and neighbourhoods to be vibrant, green, pleasant, quiet places that we'd all want to live in.
Any closing thoughts, remarks before we finish up?
One of the things that struck me about coming to Australia is you are culturally quite an outdoorsy, adventurous. That's the spirit of Australia, the spirit of adventure and people making new lives and embracing the outdoors. And that's important in itself. It can be part of the emotional push to make some of the changes that I think we need to make. You talk about yourselves being in the lucky country. Let's try and revive that vision and reconnect it with one of the things that attracts people to go to Australia in the first place, which is your love of the outdoors, of spending time in the open air.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was very inspiring for parents. We're coming into our summer holidays, so it's very timely. I'm very happy that you came on. So thank you very much for taking the time.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for enjoying Streets and People, presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website, where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.